and I want to welcome you all. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mia Burke, and I am Program Manager with Hanford Challenge. Hanford Challenge is a nonprofit based in Seattle that advocates for a safe and effective cleanup of the Hanford nuclear site. And the most important thing we do and what makes us unique is our support of workers on the front lines of cleanup. This is our 36th webinar of our Nuclear Waste Scholar Series. If you're new to the series, we started it to inspire action and involvement with Hanford Cleanup by inviting speakers to share groundbreaking scholarship, art, research, and experience working with nuclear waste. We have almost all of our previous presentations uploaded to our YouTube channel, so be sure to check those out if you're curious. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Lovely Umayam. Lovely is a writer and a nuclear nonproliferation researcher with a decade of experience in government, non-government, and academia. She is the founder of the Bombshell Toe Policy and Arts Collective, a creative collaborative using arts, culture, and history to promote nuclear nonproliferation, arms control, and disarmament. Lovely is currently a consultant at the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs. Just as a heads up, if you can't stick around for the whole presentation, feel free to leave. We will be recording the presentation and we'll share a link of the recording with everyone that registered. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lovely. I will pass it to you to talk about your work.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this lecture series. I appreciate everybody on the chat just basically sharing their locations. It's amazing to have a global crowd. And I also had a chance to look through previous presentations of this series and found people who I've admired for years. So I truly feel honored to be among them. Let me go ahead and share my slides. Perfect. Okay, so to start, again, I mentioned that I've looked at the YouTube channel, and it seems that this series has explored various nuclear issues through the vantage point of authors, artists, educators, examining how nuclear narratives have been interpreted and presented in various media and the arts. And I hope that my talk contributes to that body of knowledge. But instead of, I guess, diving right into a specific project or medium, I wanted to begin somewhere more elemental, more basic, acknowledging how our senses, and in particular the eyes, how we see, and the ways in which what we see helps us live through and make sense of this terrifying, and at times beautiful world that has to harness or is inflicted by the technologies of the atom. So before I move on, I'd like to invite everybody on this virtual space to sort of take a deep breath and, settle in. Close your eyes if you'd like. But in your mind's eye, recall the image you most associate with the word nuclear. Even if multiple images flood in. If you think it's obvious to you, that's okay. I'd like you to carry those images with you as we journey through our hour together. So I'll give folks maybe a few more seconds. Hopefully, you've got something in mind. Okay. So to begin, I am a nuclear nonproliferation researcher by training. I've dedicated over a decade to the work of nonproliferation, arms control, and disarmament. But I did not grow up passionate about these issues. The world that I was born into was vastly different from the one in which nuclear weapons were first invented, detonated, amassed during the height of the Cold War. Um, I was born in the late 80s in the Philippines. I have no memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I miss the duck and cover drills of the 50s. And I did not see any mushroom clouds from atmospheric nuclear tests broadcast on television. But what I did grow up with was this. And I don't mean to be sort of flippant. It's the truth. Again, growing up in Manila, a non-nuclear weapon state, had a very small, nuclear research program. I was too young, and at that time I was too young to follow world politics, but nuclear technology found its way into my life through this three-eyed fish in the hit American TV show, The Simpsons. And this was the image I initially associated with the word nuclear before I even knew what that word meant. This obviously didn't teach me about the different kinds of technologies for military or peaceful uses. But upon sort of meeting Blinky, I learned to associate nuclear with toxic, with alien, but also filtered through the child's eyes, it was also funny and light. And then many years passed, and to my own, surprise, I found myself in a profession exclusively focused on ensuring peaceful use of nuclear technology. And I won't necessarily go into, how I ended up there. Honestly, it was unplanned. There was no single defining moment that made me think that this was going to be my life's work, my vocation. But as a junior staff working on nuclear safeguards and security issues at the National Nuclear Security Administration, I was gradually exposed to a multitude of people and expertise. And with that, I heard stories and saw images that formed a mosaic of what it meant to live in a world that controls and is dependent on the terror and wonder of the atom. So instead of, I guess, a single aha moment for me that made me want to do this work, I would say it was the accumulation of stories and images that made me think, wow, this is really complicated. This is really important. And I really want to dig into this. So, if I may, I'd like to share a few of those stories and images with you. First, beginning with Jamaica, which seems random. This talk will take you to many places, so please bear with me. But I found myself in Kingston, Jamaica, a few times because the country operates a nuclear research reactor, and we had a partnership to train their staff on safety and security. And the scientists there were super proud of this big book they published. It's literally like huge, titled A Geochemical Atlas of Jamaica. And they analyzed the island's soil using nuclear techniques. And with that, created these maps showing the distribution of elements across the entire country, like cobalt on the right-hand side. Again, they were very proud of this because that data directly informed Jamaica's agricultural planning. The image of this book kind of stayed with me because it was like a unique story of nuclear technology as cartographer. But there was something else during those trips that I saw that I could not unsee. This is not an actual picture I took. This is just like a screenshot from a different paper about this issue. But it's essentially radioactive sources that had ended up in junkyards. Not necessarily, sources coming from the research reactor, but machines like X-ray machines or used for industry or under other industrial purposes. And they were handled by people who had no idea how dangerous they were. They were just trying to find metal to sell. So here, nuclear technology tells a different story, one of abandonment and ignorance, and an invisible health risk hiding in plain sight. And I share this because for me, the impact of the nuclear turns up in the most unexpected places. It is nuanced, it needs unpacking. Like these images, the frames of Jamaica's atomic world had a way of pulling me in. Uh, this work was not just about the expertise or the politics. through images and stories, I started to see nuclear material and technologies as something that moves through and affect people's lives and places. And to bring this back to the United States, I'd like to share the first image of Hanford that I encountered early in my career. And I guess no surprise there, it's the B reactor, the story of technological achievement. Coming into the nuclear policy field through the government, I was immediately given this image and narrative that Hanford was instrumental in winning the war. And if I recall correctly, I heard that story sitting through like an orientation, literally in that B reactor hall, as a fellow. But eventually, as I met more people and deepened my research, Hanford also became this. And you know, for some of you in the audience, this is probably the image that drives the work that you do, the contaminated water tanks and the hardship of cleanup. So, as I mentioned earlier, I've come to see our world as a mosaic of nuclear stories and images, each piece complementing or contradicting the others. And it becomes this very complicated and sometimes confusing picture. And I've become increasingly interested in a particular question, which is why do certain images win out, and while others remain unseen? That is not neutral or an accidental process. You know, the images that rise to the top, the three-eyed fish, the bee reactor, the mushroom cloud, they end up shaping public perception. They end up driving policy. They determine where attention and resources flow. Um, and what gets left out of that frame also face consequences, right? And there's some really interesting hard research about this, if I may just share. There are two researchers, I believe their name is Jonathan Barron and Stephen Herzog. They conducted this survey of Americans back in, I want to say 2019, 2020, and found that about like 60% of the respondents had a strong association with destructive nuclear imagery, even after given information about civilian technologies. So, what that suggests is that nuclear weapons is the dominant visual frame and drives attitudes towards nuclear energy, but not the other way around. Um, but what was really interesting is that the association with nuclear weapons is so strong that what came to mind for a lot of these respondents was the word bomb and not waste. Like, I don't think waste even made the top 10 association. And then the literature that I've read on imagery and public perception specific to nuclear waste has been primarily about the public opposition to future storage sites or how to build them, and the government distrust on how long-term siting should be handled. But as you know, this is not the full picture, right? There's also the history of and current state of cleanup, the people already living with the consequences of decades of nuclear weapons production, and what it actually takes to sort of achieve trust and accountability to get that cleanup done. Um, and so the one thing I'll also mention here is a pioneer of data visualization. His name is Edward Tufte. I believe he's either in Princeton or Yale, but he's written about the power of what he called the thinking eye. I love using this in a lot of my presentations because it's just an incredibly useful framework. But it's basically the idea that seeing is a form of thinking because the experience of seeing information and processing that information is ultimately absorbed as part of one's worldview. And I think, you know, our world um, with nuclear technology sits at that intersection of science, global security, and as I'm also, trying to make the case for aesthetics. How something is shown or not shown is itself a significant part of the work. And it's never, static. It's always shifting. And I argue that it's shifting right now. So what I'd like to do for the remainder of this conversation is look through emerging and alternative visual frames to help guide our understanding of this world. So, what are some of the dominant visual frames today? In the interest of time, I'll only focus on one in particular because it's been at the top of my mind lately and because it has direct bearing on how we see and understand nuclear waste. So over the past few months, I've been doing a lot of talks with college students about their perception of nuclear issues. And one observation that kept recurring for this generation, the mushroom cloud is changing. Like it's not no longer the dominant or the only sort of dominant or main visual signifier. It hasn't disappeared. It still sort of lives in all of our minds, kept alive by movies, TV shows, pop culture. But increasingly, the images that they are actually engaging with when it comes to current events um, look more like this. Nuclear technology and infrastructure mediated through satellite imagery. Just because when you see headlines, when you swipe through your phone and get like updated on current events, it's a satellite image that you typically see, right? And this is worth noting because it is an emerging frame. On one hand, it's a view that looks down on land, but in the process of doing so, it flattens that land and detaches the human eye from the ground. And at a certain point, these start looking the same, right? Like abstract and interchangeable. And I haven't found recent studies examining the specific impact of satellite imagery on public perception of nuclear issues. But in my conversations with students, this a pattern has sort of emerged that this frame contributes to a sense of distancing between themselves and the human experience of living near, working at, being affected by nuclear sites. And it's sort of a view from nowhere. And actually, a few sociologists, anthropologists have used that terminology when it comes to satellite imagery. It's a view from nowhere. And it sort of produces this like, you don't really know where you're looking from, right? You're obviously looking down like a God's eye view or bird's eye view, but that is detached from an actual perspective. And I think that has implications for the nuclear policy field. You know, especially those who work on individual, community, and environmental well-being when it comes to, you know, uh, nuclear issues. We have to be able to picture the people and the places in order to protect it or clean it up. Um, and if this emerging visual frame is pulling us away from that towards something that's a little bit more abstract, what do we lose? And what does that mean for the future of this work? But I will also note that it's not only what images we are shown, but how we see and encounter these images. And, unfortunately, in our digital age or social media age, we all sort of encounter it the same way in fragments and in our screens. In our digital lives, we are plugged in constantly, inundated with information. We are also now, unfortunately, trained to second guess everything that we see because of the rise of AI. And even when the information in front of you is true, I think we've also been conditioned to process it as entertainment, right? We scroll past it, we rate it, all of those things that affect our thinking eye. And I think this information environment has created the conditions for spectacle. Uh, so this is an image that circulated in 2024 of a social media influencer. She calls herself a nuclear influencer, kissing a cask of nuclear waste, posted in support of, as you can see here, Diablo Canyon in California. There's a lot missing here, right? Like there's a different waste profile, different context, different politics. But to my point about it's not only what we see, but how we see, um, it's this exists now in a fragmented information architecture, right? It's being retweeted, reposted, without that context. And, the ways in which this image can live on and be passed down, it's now communicating something that actually affects us all in this field, right? Some of my friends have seen this, so friends outside of the field, and they were very honest with me that, like, oh, without proper context, this is signaling that nuclear waste across the board is not a big deal. And this is something that you can be playful about. So, how do we then see um, the nuclear world, our atomic world, differently? How can we find agency um, in, living in this world? And so, just sort of transitioning to my own projects, my own examples, I want to share you these photos. So I know I just scrolled past them quickly, and I'll dive into these projects in a moment. But by just uh, encountering them the way that you did, would you believe that these images are also about our atomic world? Um, these are from two projects I had the great fortune of being a part of. And uh, I think we have time to kind of dig into both of them. But these projects are made possible by Bomb Shelto, which is a policy and arts collective I founded. And the idea is to bring together policy researchers like me with historians, with scientists, activists, artists, affected communities. And the premise of this collective is actually simple, but I've come to realize can be quite radical. That one, local expertise matters, especially from those who have experienced the consequences and uh, irresponsible, unethical use of nuclear technology. And the idea there is to sort of fight that distancing that has happened over time as more and more young people don't have uh, the reference points to anchor them to this issue. And then I would say the second uh, premise is that the arts can achieve a reorientation that policy work cannot. And that in order to move the needle on and this issue, you have to be pairing this with sort of rigorous policy analysis with compelling aesthetics. And to me, Bomb Shelter over time, this is not just an exercise of promoting uh, my work or improving comms. I think sometimes people think that art is like a communication tool, but complementing my policy research with creative practice has actually made me think differently about nuclear history and policy, sort of challenging me to think about how nuclear material and technology sort of move through space and time. And so I'd like to just go ahead and share with you the first project here. So this is Ways of Knowing. It's a short documentary film that we produced under Bomb Shelto alongside executive producer Sunny Dooley, Adriel Lewis, and Frizzly Soberanis. This is a film directed by Caleb Briette and photographed by Carmel Garcia back in 2017, 2018. We started the work a long time ago in 2018, but it premiered at South by Southwest last year. So it's years in the making. A lot of that is because of COVID, but also relationship building takes time. Okay, so pardon me as I read a little bit here. Just a few statistics, but I think Sunny, our executive producer, storyteller that you just heard from, mentioned some of this already. So from 1944 until the 1980s, nearly 30 million tons of uranium ore were extracted from Navajo lands under leases with the Navajo Nation, first exclusively for defense purposes, then it shifted to commercial use. Many Navajo people worked the mines, often living and raising families in close proximity to the mines and mills. Today, there is uranium mining in the United States. I believe in Wyoming, but there is concerns that that will ramp up given the talk about a new nuclear renaissance, pairing it with AI, right? The data centers. But the mines in Navajo Nation decades ago remain unmarked and abandoned. As Sunny said, there are over 500 abandoned uranium mines that still need to be cleaned up. But speaking to some Navajo scholars like Dr. Tommy Rock, who's featured in the film, he would contest that and say there's actually more because of the way that these mines are counted, right, as opposed to clusters like individual. But you know, let's face it, to most Americans, these are just big numbers that sound hollow because they have never been to this place deep in the reservation. They don't know what it's like to live in and love native land. And so this is where Sunny Dooley wanted to start this story through an indigenous orientation of the six sacred mountains that serve as the primary reference point. So, Ways of Knowing is this short film that acknowledges that nuclear material, in this case uranium, is something that is not, it doesn't by default exist in a bomb or a facility. It's something that comes from the earth, and that is the human act of extraction and contamination that transforms this element, our relationship with this natural element, into a destructive force. And I think in telling this story, it was important that we lead with an Indigenous perspective from content and format. And, you know, while Ways of Knowing is a very different nuclear story and have a very different nuclear imagery to what happened in, let's say, Hanford, there are similar threads, right? Like a community living in the long shadow of nuclear weapons production, you know, the wait for cleanup, how it's always underfunded or sort of pushed aside, so it's never quite finished. Um, and at the same time, seeing more and more investments in other nuclear infrastructure, right? But with Ways of Knowing, the real intention here is to sort of highlight the sacred life on the land and the love that it continues to receive from the people who live on that land. And this is a frame in which audiences are invited to appreciate the beauty of this place. And in doing so, can come to understand why it's important to protect. Because that's also one thing that we've talked a lot about with Navajo community members is that when your frame is just contamination and destruction, there isn't really a reference point as to like what that land was before and who has lived there, what kinds of life has been on it. And I think in order for people who are not aware of the story, if they have both references points, when we have again a mosaic of nuclear stories and images to give you a fuller picture, then that's when it might be more effective. And so that is why in this film, it we know that it coexists with other nuclear, like Navajo nuclear stories. So we're not trying to say that this is like the best or the only. We are trying to share or show a different entry point to maybe fill in like a gap or share like a nuanced dimension uh, so that someone else will be pulled in to this particular history. Um, just really quickly, I may have forgotten to mention, like in the beginning of introducing this project, that this is initially a 360 VR film. It's an immersive film. You're supposed to put on a headset to watch it. And this is with a lot of intention. And you probably noticed in the clip that I shared, it's very slow. And you're like, why is this so meditative and slow? Nothing moves. It's because the original format, you're supposed to put on your headset and be able to look around. So the viewers can really step into Navajo Nation, simulate, sunny storytelling around like a fire, right? And it also allows the mountains to tower above you, which really makes them into living characters in the film. And I'll also note that with a headset, it's actually purposefully disorienting. In this world, there are no state borders to guide you, or at least we don't really tell you where the sacred mountains are by state just yet. That comes in the end. We want you to question where you are. And you kind of have no choice but to trust the characters in this film, the native like knowledge bearers of the land to lead you through the history lesson. And then later on, that's when you realize, oh, where the specific sacred mountains are on the map of the United States. So there's also something about using the medium of VR to really center the indigenous perspective. Um, but I will point out that we're very aware that the headset is technology is monopolized by Meta, and we're increasingly uncomfortable with depending on this technology, given Meta's history as a company. And so we are exploring other formats. And people have also requested, like, can we watch this as a community, as a group, because that will have a different feel. And so right now we're testing out a planetarium format. And there's also something really beautiful about that too. Oftentimes when we watch something in a dome format in a planetarium, it's oftentimes like, looking outside of Earth. And this kind of inverts that of like, how do we appreciate where we are um, on Earth? And I guess I'll end by saying that with ways of knowing, this allows us to not think about contamination in a vacuum, but really forces us to confront how it intersects and influences issues like Indigenous rights, environmental stewardship, and community health. And I want to be cognizant of the time here, so I want to make space for Q&A, so I'll speed through the second example, which is still like a work in progress anyway. But 2 years ago, I was um, asked to do this research project as a UN consultant to kind of look at the challenges that current scholars face in recording and presenting the stories of atomic bomb survivors that are now aging and passing away. The average age of a hibakusha, Japanese for atomic bomb survivor, is now 85. And so we are sort of at that period where we are about to lose survivors as witnesses, as a primary source. And it just so happened that I dove into this work during a time when I was trying to fit into a new identity as a mom. This was not planned this way, but this process of research became more profound because I was not just wrestling with the past, but also actively thinking about and cultivating this new future in the form of a crazy, energetic toddler that I had to bring to Japan with me because I wasn't ready to leave him for like weeks at a time to do this research project. So the following images are photographs taken by my son, who was 2 when we were in Hiroshima. We gave him a Fujifilm camera, which I know is like a big risk because it's heavy, it's not like a toy, and encourage him to take pictures while sitting on his stroller just to keep him busy. So these are his. Um, just really quickly, I want to say, I want to highlight this gentleman here. His name is Mr. Terumi Tanaka. He is, I believe, either 92 or 93 now, because I spoke to him in 2024. He is uh, a hibakusha. He experienced a Nagasaki bombing at age 13 and saw a lot of harrowing things throughout his life, had to deal with the shame of being an atomic bomb survivor. And he's really channeled all of that through his work with Nihon Hidankyo. And so he was one of the first hibakusha that I met while in Japan. Um, and this is my son with his camera, age 2. And so just imagine during my research trip going back and forth, elders and a toddler, elders and a toddler. And to be with both of them was quite profound because we have a survivor who has witnessed and remembers a city destroyed, and I have a child who literally can only see a city of life and possibility. And I wanted to mention this project because I hope that this eventually becomes a story, an image of a nuclear world needing intergenerational stewardship. I think this is an underexplored frame in our field. There's a lot of images and stories about how youth are being the future, but I honestly think that's too simplistic. I think what we need is the coming together of generations to learn from and grow together. And in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the most powerful image that contains this idea are the atom bomb survivor trees and their descendant seedlings. So I'm in conversation with an amazing organization in Hiroshima called Green Legacy Hiroshima, and they work with botanists and master gardeners in Japan, basically collecting the seeds of atom bomb survivor trees um, and spreading them around the world so that these trees can continue on their legacy as survivors. And so there's a lot to unpack here in this project. It's sort of growing to be like a photo book of my son's photos. And mind you, like he took like hundreds of photos and most of them were blurry and unusable, but there were at least like 20 gems that were like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. And complementing that with, the study of atomic bomb survivor trees, and hibakusha testimony. And I'm happy to talk more about it later on if we have time for Q&A. Um, uh, but just to wrap up, just going back to Hanford, uh, I when I was talking to Mia and Liz about the images I associate with Hanford, they actually shared with me a new image that sparked curiosity and inspiration in me, which is the image of a radioactive mulberry jam. And in all honesty, I can't quite find a photo. I don't know, Mia, if there is a photo somewhere, but through the links that you shared, I did come across old articles about it during, like including the one on Seattle Times. And for those who are not familiar with the story, I guess in 1990 there was a physicist slash activist named Norm Busky who found mulberry bushes growing near the Columbia River. And they had elevated levels of strontium 90 from the contamination in Hanford. And he decided to pick them, make mulberry jam with it, and sent it to like the governor of Washington State, and I think the Secretary of Energy at that time. It was the 90s or 1990s. And I love these two quotes on here, again from the Seattle Times. And I'll just read what Busky said because he already understood the power of the thinking eye. He says, everything that leaves Hanford becomes numbers. But the reality of the mulberry jam is that it is something that is contaminated and people can see. It should be made clear to those who are ultimately responsible, the governor and the DOE. And so thank you so much for listening to me. I hope let's not take for granted our thinking eye. I'm really scared as someone who's a millennial that our younger generation is um, not training their thinking eye. And it's not completely their fault. We live in an information architecture, a digital life that is all about attention and speed, right? It's really hard to process. But I hope what I've emphasized here is that this affects our field, the things that we care about, and there is an opportunity to continue adding new images to complicate and appreciate this mosaic of our atomic world. So thank you so much, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Lovely, for walking us through this new, different way of viewing the nuclear. aside from the kind of symbols that we all thought of in the beginning. I think you've shown us some new symbols to reach out to. Um, Please, if anybody has questions, you can put them in the chat or also use the Q&A feature. And I did want to clarify for the photo of the Hanford tank, it contains nuclear waste, high-level nuclear waste, and there's 177 of them that are all buried underground, so it wouldn't be like in that photo. But just want to clarify that piece. Um, I think we have one. The first question is, can you address current issues of uranium mining with the Navajo people and what they're up against with the new proliferation to deploy nuclear power reactors?
Okay, sorry, I was muted. Uh, Currently, the biggest issue is uranium, material transport, actually. There was a big problem, was that just last year, of uranium being transported from like a ridge of the Grand Canyon um, across Navajo Nation without notifying the Navajo Nation government. And it was I know some community members that were uh, involved in a lot of the activism around that, because right now there isn't it. They are beginning to mine uranium or uh, in the one of the sides of the Grand Canyon. But the earliest indications was like the transport to like the milling site on the other side. Um, and so I know that there's a lot of activism around that. It's a little bit hard because there hasn't been sort of like an explosion of like activity, but there is a lot of like other cases in which it's very clear that the Trump administration is willing to fast track uranium mining in the country. I believe just not too long ago, he listed uranium as part of a critical minerals list. And so a lot of the activity around Navajo Nation is focused on what's happening on the Grand Canyon, starting with the transportation. And now there is some concerns about what like to the degree in which they're going to start uranium mining there. But beyond that, there hasn't been a lot, but people are gearing up for some form of like defense, knowing because there's just a lot of talk around um, again, the Trump administration getting rid of regulations or fast tracking all kinds of plans in order to uplift the current nuclear industry because of this narrative forming that there can be a, a good relationship between nuclear energy and AI. And so there it's all sort of like swirling around and people are trying to keep their eyes out on it.
Yeah, thank you. We have a couple of questions about how to watch Ways of Knowing, if it's screening in places or
Yeah. So, yes, if you're interested, I'd love to be in touch. It's the only reason why I hesitate is because whenever screen the film, I have to ask Sunny, our executive director, because her ideal screening is that she's actually in attendance and can engage the audience afterwards. So we're actually very selective with the way that we've been showing the film. We've obviously entered it in several film festivals, but the ideal environment for us is like a community center, a library, like a gallery. It's going to be in a museum in Arizona in May. I can give you details of that. In again, like several universities, because we want to make sure that this movie or this film is held. Like it's not something that we want to just license to Netflix or, you know, have. I mean, of course, we're trading off like a big reach there, But again, the intention behind the film is very specific. Uh, but yes.
And Liz shared in the chat that you can request to host a screening. Is that maybe the best way for people to reach out on the ways of
Yeah,
knowing?
yeah, that is, yes. Yes.
Okay, okay. Um, I teach ethnic studies and want to be able to make this issue more immediate and urgent to students from historically marginalized communities. What is a good way to do this?
Um, I've had a great fortune of talking to a lot of students in the past 2 months about this issue. Um, I think what has been really effective are conversations around like unexpected nuclear histories in those students where they're from,
Mhm.
um, and making it personal, right? And I think just being very honest with that tension between global security and local security. And I think that that's where a lot of the marginalized stories come. Because it's not so much as, for me at least, what I've learned in doing this work, it's not so much as just highlighting, marginalized, erased nuclear histories, but really critically thinking why and how it happens. And so, if any of the audience members are interested, I can share a list of like amazing professors I've worked with that have created curricula or thought about like a lecture in this. But I've come to really appreciate, you know, sharing this with students in a way that makes it personal to them. And again, like what I love about this work is they come from very unexpected places.
Mhm.
And that's what sticks to your memory. Like Jamaica, I was just like, oh, it will probably be, you know, it, I would have imagined that like working somewhere like Ukraine or China, but like there was something beautiful about like understanding the relationship of nuclear stories in Jamaica. And so, and I've noticed that in other students when they're tasked to kind of like look through like nuclear histories of their own, like where they grew up. And then from there, uh, really being critical about how this happens in the first place, how certain stories become marginalized.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for this brilliant talk. What advice can you give to others who would like to develop similar initiatives that bring together artists and researchers to create new stories and images about our atomic world? Is there a network of organizations doing this work alongside Bombshell Toe?
Um, you know, it's been really difficult if I'm being honest with you because again, I come from like the very traditional hard security and have moved closer and closer to community work, right? And the arts. And this field is not built for that. Like I really feel like I'm in between and I have to uh, code switch or convince one or the other, right? Like either I'm not to be trusted because I have government, like a history of working for the government, which is totally understandable. But that in and of itself is labor of relationship building and trust. And then on the other side, when I'm trying to present this kind of work to people, in DC, there's a little bit of a dismissal of this is advocacy, right? And it's in order to do this work, I think you have to be okay being in the middle. And but because of that, it also exposes you to different people, right? And so to the question of similar initiatives, I think, I mean, I always come from a space of abundance. As I mentioned, it's a mosaic of stories. And so if you're inspired to do this kind of work, please do it because we need as many stories as we can in order to counterbalance the dominant narrative that we live in today. And In terms of a network of organizations, I think over time, there's a lot of orgs that have come to appreciate the power of storytelling. And Bomb Shelter is always open to talk and brainstorm and collaborate. And I'm happy to connect you with other organizations. Um, that are beginning to do the same thing. If I may just mention like one last advice,
Mhm.
especially for young people, is to appreciate the process. Because I think, again, in this day and age, it's about the product, right? Like what would look good on Instagram, what would look good. A lot of the beauty and the power of bomb shelter work is through the process of learning and unlearning and meeting people and being where they are. And I'm worried that there isn't enough being put into that. So if you're interested in this kind of work, I hope that you appreciate the process of it as well, because that's where the true magic happens. Ways of Knowing, the film, I'm glad that it exists. I'm glad that people can see it. But what I treasure the most is my relationship with Sunny Dooley, who initially did not want to talk to me because she knew me from like a nuclear policy cohort who lived in Washington, D.C. And now that it's 2026, I love her so much and call her my friend. And that is actually the product of Ways of Knowing. The film is great, and I'm glad people can see it. But it's usually the unseen practice of what the arts do to you.
Mm.
That I really hope people take away from this kind of work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. We have some comments just that I'd like to read off from the chat. I really love the project of the pictures by your son, so poignant. And thank you. I grew up with fallout shelters in the basements of the public schools I attended and near 3 Mile Island. Remember when it opened and the accident? I appreciate you asking us to think about our mental images of nuclear. Mining and waste is not top of my mind, but is equally important and should be prevalent.
Hmm.
And thank you. We really appreciate your scholarship. Just watching this with my 12-year-old, they were impressed with your child's photos and wanted to note that they think Tennessee has some active uranium extraction too. I don't know. I don't have generative questions for you, but wanted to mention that I worked on an archaeological excavation on the uranium mining lands during the 90s. I watched explosions on the horizon line as I dug and after work washed in the uranium company showers. Once after working, I visited the mountain and noted the claw marks of bears on trees as we ascended. Thank you for this work, which allows me to deepen my understanding. So just
Thank
wanted
you
to.
so much. And I hope, it again, sometimes I worry that am I being too simplistic, but I'm always so surprised by what people say from like a very simple question of what does the word nuclear elicit? I think part of that too is just being in the work for so long. I sometimes forget that this is novel, or emotional, or, like you just never know people's histories and experiences with this word. And I think this is also what I love about Bomb Shelter is that it really forces me to not think like an expert, because that comes with blind spots and assumptions. And not saying that it's not valuable, it has a place, but that's not the whole story and that's not the whole picture. And I think oftentimes when we encounter nuclear related news online, I mean, right now it's being dominated by the Iran war and all of that. Like it really flattens and kind of reduces the story, right? And so I really appreciate you all for really taking that question to heart.
We do have someone with us, Marco Kaltofen, who has worked with Hanford Challenge in the past. Writing into the chat, I should have said I possess the mulberry jam at my lab at WPI in Massachusetts and has photos and spectra that it can send us offline. So
I
I
think you should preserve that image. I think it's powerful. And when you told me that, and when I was building my deck, right? And, there's that influencer Isodope with her own activism by way of kissing a nuclear waste cask. There's something interesting there, right? Like what Busky did was so brave and so cheeky and so radical, right? I don't know if he was arrested. I'm not sure. Like I just learned this story from you guys.
Mm.
Um, but and then kind of contrasting that to activism now.
Mm.
And there's something there that I think is very powerful, but how do collect these images around Hanford, the land itself and how beautiful it is, the actual contamination, the activism that has happened and inspired by it. The tumbleweeds, right, was another like plant. That in and of itself is an amazing story. I did end up reading the LA Times article about was there like a big storm that swept a bunch of like tumbleweeds. You know, um, it's very rich, right? And it's just about how do you one collect them because I don't think it's um what's the word? Uh, Sometimes we forget that that has to be intentional, right? And also kind of looking at them together, pulling them together, stepping back and seeing what is this story telling me? And how can I share these images to a public so that they have a better understanding of what Hanford is, So that's
Yeah.
very cool. I'm so glad you have those pictures, Marco.
Yes, me too. I think that ends it for the questions that we have. Thank you so much, Lovely, for sharing your time with us and
Yeah.
sharing this presentation. Yes.
And I just did want to mention to Linda, who I think just scrolling through the
Oh, yeah.
comments. Yeah, it was the Pinyon Plain Mine on uh, near the Grand Canyon, and the uranium was being transported to White Mesa in Utah. So like crossed Navajo Nation, and like the tribal government had no idea that that was happening. Um, but yes, so that's the what I was referring to. I just didn't want to say like the wrong name, so I hesitated. But thank you for jogging my memory. But yeah, thank you so much
Watching
for
that.
this. I really appreciated it. I appreciate you all for listening to me, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.